It all started on a morning that should have been ordinary. The kind of morning where the sunlight streams in lazily through the blinds, birds are chirping outside, and you're lulled into a false sense of calm, thinking life is predictable, stable, and safe. I should have known better. My name is Nora, and last month, my world shifted in ways I never imagined, because someone I trusted implicitly decided that my life and my security were theirs to manipulate. The message came innocuously enough, a simple notification in my inbox at work, the kind I ignored daily without thought. But this one stopped me cold. An email from the bank, subject line bold and official, detailing a transaction that made my stomach drop before I even read the numbers. 6 figures. Tied to the property my grandmother had spent years leaving to me, meticulously ensuring that it would be my safety net, the one thing no one could touch. And yet, as I stared at the email, scrolling to the attachment, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't a mistake. The sale had closed. My signature wasn't on any of the documents. Nothing I had consented to, nothing I had agreed to, and yet the money was gone. My mother had done it, my own mother. She had sold the beach house my grandmother had left me, and not for bills, not for some urgent emergency that couldn't wait, but to fund a luxury vacation for my brother, the golden child of our family who had always seemed to get more than his share. The audacity of it knocked the wind out of me. I replayed the memory of every summer spent in that house, every corner of the rooms my grandmother had cared for with such tenderness. I remembered the laughter echoing through the halls, the smell of salt in the air, and the way I had imagined, countless times, that one day this place would be mine. A sanctuary, a place I could always rely on when the world got too heavy. And now it had been traded for cocktails on a beach, Instagram posts, and plane tickets. My mother had looked me in the eye when she explained it, as though this simple gesture of betrayal was a form of kindness. "You don't need a house," she said, as though my need for security and stability was less important than her desire to be the savior of my brother's fleeting happiness. He had laughed, of course, echoing her sentiments, enjoying the thrill of indulgence while oblivious to the consequences of his enjoyment. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely this had to be a mistake, some glitch in the system, some error that would be corrected once I reached the right person at the bank. But as I read through the closing documents, the truth revealed itself in black and white. My grandmother had intended that house for me. The trust had been clear. Her notes, scribbled meticulously in that blue binder she had kept beside her chair for years, had always emphasized that this was mine, that no one else should interfere. And yet there it was, a transaction that bypassed my consent entirely. My hands shook as I closed the laptop and grabbed my keys. I needed to confront them. I needed to see with my own eyes the people who had turned something sacred into a pawn for their selfish desires. The drive to my mother's house was filled with a tension I had never felt before, a cocktail of anger, disbelief, and a simmering determination that made my chest feel tight. My mind raced through every possible scenario, every possible excuse they might offer, but deep down I knew it didn't matter. The action had been taken, and now I had to respond. When I pulled onto her street, the bright red sold sign glared back at me like a taunt. For a brief second, absurdity struck me, and I almost laughed at the surrealism of it all, but the laughter didn't reach my eyes. This was real. This had happened. Ethan, my brother, opened the door before I could knock, barefoot and casually scrolling through his phone, the grin on his face as carefree as the ocean he had flown across while I sat at my desk, staring at my lost inheritance. "Hey, sis," he said lightly, and my blood boiled. Bali. That's where he was. That's where my grandmother's gift had been liquidated to fund. I pushed past him into the living room, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "Did Mom tell you where that money came from?" He paused, hesitated, then shrugged. "It's family money, Nora. You don't even live by the coast. You've got a good job. I've been drowning. I needed a vacation." The casual dismissal, the tone of entitlement made my jaw tighten. No, this wasn't about vacation. This was about respect. This was about boundaries. This was about someone finally understanding that I would not be the silent victim of their manipulation. And then she appeared, my mother, still holding the flyers for her real estate listings, phone wedged between shoulder and ear, the blazer she always wore when she wanted to appear professional, confident, untouchable. She froze when she saw me, the first crack in her composure, before slipping seamlessly back into rehearsed calm. "Nora, honey, what are you doing here in the middle of the day?" she asked, a rhetorical question meant to disarm. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I laid it out calmly, with a voice that felt foreign in its steadiness. I had seen the emails. I had seen the closing documents. I knew she had acted without consent, using a power of attorney she no longer had authority over. She had sold the house that was meant to be mine and redirected the proceeds to fund her chosen priorities. She offered explanations, excuses about bills, Ethan's struggles, and the harshness of the market. She rationalized, explained, justified, but each word was a reminder that for her, the lines of legality and morality were blurred in favor of what she wanted. I listened, composed, and felt a clarity I had never known. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a minor error. This was deliberate. And for the first time, I realized the power I held. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't the one who would swallow the injustice. I could respond. I could take action. I called my lawyer, Jasmine, a trusted friend and expert in these matters. Within hours, a plan was formed. A demand letter that would cut through excuses and force accountability, setting a 48-hour deadline to begin rectifying the damage or face legal consequences. It felt harsh, almost merciless, but it was necessary. I was reclaiming what was mine, not just for myself, but for the principle that my boundaries and my rights could not be disregarded. And as I prepared to take this first decisive step, the reality of what I was doing sank in. I wasn't just confronting my mother and brother. I was confronting years of patterns, old habits of submission, and a lifetime of being the responsible one while others took liberties at my expense. But this time, the tables had turned. I had one secret left, a leverage born of truth and law, and I was ready to see what would happen when they finally realized that I was no longer the victim. The 48 hours felt like an eternity. Every notification on my phone made my heart skip a beat. Would they respond? Would they even take me seriously? My mother's confidence, her calm dismissal of what she had done, was exactly what made this so tense. She had always believed she could bend reality to suit her needs, that her authority as a parent gave her the right to rewrite the rules when convenient. But this time, the rules weren't negotiable. I had the law on my side, backed by every document my grandmother had meticulously prepared, every note she had left for me about the house, about the investment account, about safeguarding my future. I reviewed the documents again and again, almost obsessively, because clarity would be my weapon. There was no ambiguity. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary. The power of attorney had ended the moment my grandmother passed. Any action she had taken after that was a violation, plain and simple. And now my mother would have to answer. Ethan, of course, texted. He alternated between mockery, guilt-tripping, and futile attempts at humor. "You really sent that letter. Mom's freaking out. Calm down," he wrote. Another message. "This is insane. You're turning everything into a war." I didn't reply. There was no reason to argue with someone who had been complicit in the betrayal. Their discomfort wasn't my concern anymore. Their accountability was. I spent the hours before the deadline preparing myself mentally. I rehearsed what I would say if they called, how I would stand my ground if they tried to manipulate me. Every scenario played out in my head, every excuse I anticipated, every plea they might make. I was ready. When the phone finally rang, it was my mother, voice tight with outrage, attempting to reassert control. "Nora, what is this? Some kind of attack?" she demanded. I kept my voice even. "It's not an attack. It's a formal notice outlining the legal implications of selling property that isn't yours. You have 48 hours to comply." There was a pause, then a burst of argument, justification, pleas about family, bills, Ethan's well-being. But every word only reinforced the clarity of what I had to do. I was not asking for sympathy. I was demanding responsibility. They had thought they could manipulate reality, that they could treat my grandmother's legacy as a resource for their convenience. Now they were seeing that the consequences of their choices were unavoidable. The next step, filing the lawsuit, was necessary, and I moved forward with a calm certainty I hadn't known I possessed. The courtroom was surreal. Walking into the space where family dynamics and personal history would collide with law and justice felt almost cinematic. Jasmine sat beside me, a solid anchor of expertise and reassurance. Across from us, my mother's lawyer tried to position her as a victim, painting the narrative as one of misunderstood intentions, of good intentions gone wrong. Ethan hovered, an uneasy witness to a drama he had been complicit in. As the proceedings began, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety, but it was tempered with resolve. I was there to tell the truth, not to win popularity or approval. The judge listened as Jasmine outlined the facts: the irrevocable trust, the explicit termination of the power of attorney upon my grandmother's death, the unauthorized sale, and the diversion of funds. Each point was clear, irrefutable. I watched my mother's face as the details were presented, noting the flicker of panic, the attempt to hide it behind controlled breaths and practiced calm. Ethan's expression shifted too, from casual detachment to discomfort, realizing that the fantasy of impunity was crumbling. When my mother took the stand, she attempted to narrate her story: Bill's hardships, Ethan's struggles. But every word contradicted the written evidence. Jasmine then presented the text messages, the emails, the screenshots that documented knowledge of wrongdoing. Each piece of evidence was a mirror reflecting the truth they had tried to obscure. The tension was electric, almost unbearable. And yet, as the judge considered the case, the clarity of the law prevailed over familial manipulation. When the verdict came, it was as satisfying as it was necessary. My mother had breached her fiduciary duty, misused expired authority, and converted trust property for personal use. The financial consequences were severe: repayment of the full fair market value, interest, attorney's fees. Her confidence, once unshakable, had been replaced with stark reality. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in humiliation. What mattered was justice, accountability, and the reclamation of what had always been mine. Ethan, observing the outcome, finally seemed to grasp the gravity of their choices. For the first time, he acknowledged, however quietly, the imbalance of our family dynamic and the consequences of enabling selfish decisions. The aftermath was sobering. Legal consequences rippled outward: letters from creditors, garnished accounts, a reality my mother had never had to face when bending rules to her will. Her lifestyle contracted to fit her actual means, a direct reflection of her choices rather than my actions. The power of the law had restored balance, not through vengeance, but through the enforcement of clear, structured consequences. I, meanwhile, began to reconstruct my own life, not just financially, but emotionally. Boundaries, once blurred by years of expectation and manipulation, were now firm. I invested in my future, honoring the trust my grandmother had placed in me, and for the first time made decisions purely for myself, unmediated by guilt or obligation. And in that clarity, I discovered something unexpected: empowerment. The kind that comes not from winning against someone, but from claiming your space, your rights, and your dignity. Family, I realized, does not absolve responsibility, nor does love grant the right to exploit. Sometimes, protecting what is yours, even against those you care for, is the truest form of integrity. And as life moved forward, I carried the lessons learned, not resentment, but resolve. The house was more than a property. It was a symbol of standing firm, of refusing to allow manipulation to dictate my future. The money, once stolen, became a tool for growth, education, and community outreach, honoring the spirit of my grandmother's intention. And in these choices, I found peace, not because my mother or brother had changed, but because I had. Because I had finally realized that standing up, even when it risks breaking old patterns, is sometimes the only way to preserve the things that truly matter. The secret I had kept until the very last moment, the evidence, the legal leverage, the careful preparation, wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming agency. And when the dust settled, I realized that no betrayal, no matter how personal, could diminish the value of the life I chose to lead once I took control. After the court verdict, life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about money, though that mattered. It was about reclaiming a narrative that had been hijacked, about taking control over a future that had been manipulated for someone else's convenience. I started small, restructuring my finances, setting up a proper investment plan, and ensuring that every decision I made had my grandmother's legacy in mind. The lessons she had left me, scribbled in margins, highlighted in blue ink, suddenly felt alive. They weren't just instructions, they were a philosophy, a blueprint for protecting myself in a world where family could betray just as easily as they could love. My mother, meanwhile, had to confront reality every single day. Gone were the quick fixes, the excuses, and the emotional manipulations that had carried her for years. Her bills were real. Her debts were real. Her assets were reachable. And for the first time, she had to live with the consequences of her choices. Ethan's life also shifted, though less dramatically. He had to face the discomfort of understanding that shortcuts, vacations, and temporary relief do not erase responsibility. His texts became less dismissive, more reflective, though still tinged with frustration. But even in their discomfort, I noticed a subtle shift, a recognition that the world does not bend to selfish whims, and that honesty, accountability, and preparation are the only reliable safeguards. I used this time to build new boundaries. I didn't cut ties completely, but I made them intentional. Calls were scheduled, emails responded to, and visits planned on terms that protected my space. I no longer absorbed their crises as if they were mine. Instead, I offered guidance where appropriate and let natural consequences teach the rest. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing them suffer, though there was a quiet sense of justice. It was in knowing that I could navigate the complexities of family, betrayal, and greed without losing myself in the process. I started to share my experiences carefully, first with friends, then with small community groups, explaining the importance of understanding legal documents, powers of attorney, and trusts. People were shocked. So many admitted they had been taken advantage of or had avoided difficult conversations with loved ones out of fear or guilt. It became clear that my story wasn't unique. It was a mirror reflecting the quiet struggles of anyone trying to maintain integrity, while others manipulate circumstances for their own gain. I realized I had a responsibility, not just to myself, but to others, to teach what I had learned. That preparation, legal literacy, and clear boundaries are essential, even within family. And yet, the emotional work was ongoing. Nights were spent replaying confrontations, rereading messages, and acknowledging feelings of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I journaled, meditated, and spoke to therapists who helped me unpack layers of inherited guilt and long-standing family dynamics. The act of articulating my story in a safe space reinforced my clarity. I wasn't the villain. I hadn't overreacted. I had simply refused to allow exploitation to continue unchecked. Slowly, life began to regain its rhythm. I cultivated friendships that were mutually supportive, started volunteering at legal aid clinics to educate others about trust and inheritance rights, and leaned into my career with a renewed focus. Every professional success felt deeper, grounded not only in skill, but in resilience. The secret I had held, the evidence, the preparation, the legal strategy, had given me leverage, yes, but more importantly, it had given me confidence. Confidence that standing up for what's right does not make you cruel or unforgiving. It makes you vigilant, prepared, and unshakable. My mother's reactions continued to fluctuate. Some days she expressed regret, though rarely sincerely. Other days, she attempted to engage in manipulation, seeking sympathy or attempting to reframe the story in her favor. I met each attempt with calm, clear boundaries. I listened, I responded when necessary, and I withdrew when manipulation arose. It was exhausting at times, but each interaction reinforced a simple truth. Accountability matters more than comfort, and integrity is non-negotiable. Ethan, for his part, began to take steps to stabilize his own life. He worked longer hours, faced his financial realities, and slowly, grudgingly, understood the impact of his complicity. Our relationship was tentative, but the transparency that had been forced by legal necessity now allowed a foundation for cautious trust. I didn't celebrate victories with him, but I acknowledged effort when it aligned with responsibility. The most profound realization, however, was that revenge or justice wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming agency. That's the secret I had kept all along, the knowledge that no one could take what I had been legally entrusted with if I refused to allow it. The documents, the emails, the binder full of my grandmother's handwriting, they weren't just evidence. They were shields, symbols of preparation, proof that knowledge is power. And power, when wielded with clarity and calm, does not need to be loud to be effective. Looking back now, I can see the trajectory clearly. A family dynamic skewed by manipulation and favoritism, a moment of betrayal, a careful reclaiming of rights, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust with myself and my life. The emotional toll was steep, but necessary. The financial consequences for my mother and brother were consequences of choices, not my own malice. And in this clarity, I discovered something extraordinary. Resilience isn't born from comfort or ease. It's forged in the moments when everything is at risk, and you decide to act with principle, intelligence, and courage. In the months following, I continued to balance the legal and emotional dimensions of the fallout. Court-ordered payments trickled in, structured and enforceable, while life went on around me. I hosted workshops on financial literacy, estate planning, and navigating family conflict. Strangers, friends, colleagues, they all responded to the authenticity of my story. I realized that my ordeal, as personal and painful as it had been, could serve a larger purpose. And so, I chose to transform betrayal into empowerment, manipulation into education, and a family conflict into a testament of standing firm without losing integrity. 1 year later, when I sat quietly in my apartment overlooking the city, the blue binder still on my desk, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for decades. I had honored my grandmother's intentions, enforced the law, and most importantly, protected my future. My mother and brother continued to navigate their lives with the consequences they had earned, and I navigated mine with boundaries, agency, and clarity. The person who backstabbed me thought they had won. They believed that comfort, manipulation, and entitlement would override preparation, law, and resolve. But I had one secret left, one tool no betrayal could overcome: knowledge and the courage to act on it. And in the end, that secret wasn't just my leverage, it was my liberation, the quiet triumph of standing up when it mattered most. The house, the money, the trust, all of it was secondary to the empowerment I discovered in that struggle. And if there's a single lesson I can share with anyone watching, it's this: betrayal can hurt, family can deceive, but preparedness, clarity, and unwavering resolve are the forces that ensure you are never truly powerless. Hold on to your secrets wisely, act decisively, and never let anyone convince you that what is rightfully yours can be taken without consequences. Sometimes, the quietest victories are the most profound, and the most dangerous people underestimate the one who has nothing left to lose but everything to protect.